May 12, 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty parade ground as 23 women in wrinkled Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms stood at rigid attention, their faces etched with exhaustion and uncertainty at 3,000 miles from the battlefields they had known. They believed they were being brought to America to face harsh interrogation, possibly torture. After all, wasn't that how the Americans would treat the enemies of democracy? Lieutenant Elsa Muller glanced sidelong at her fellow prisoners, silently reassuring them with a practiced look that had served her well during their service in the Flugabwehrkanone batteries. Little did she know that within 6 months, everything she thought she understood about America, about power, about her place in the world, would be irrevocably transformed. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a group of captured German servicewomen, indoctrinated by years of Nazi propaganda, encountered a reality so fundamentally different from what they had been taught that it didn't merely challenge their beliefs, it shattered their entire worldview and revealed to them the true foundation of American power that Hitler had catastrophically underestimated. The women had been captured during the Allied bombing campaigns over German industrial centers in early 1944. Most had served in the Luftwaffenhelferinnen, the women's auxiliary of the German Air Force, operating communication equipment and serving in anti-aircraft units. Their capture had been a shock. Most had never imagined they would be taken prisoner, much less transported across the Atlantic to America itself. "Attention!" barked Major Robert Dawson, the camp commandant, as he approached the formation. The Texas heat was unfamiliar and oppressive to the German women, several of whom were already showing signs of heat stroke despite the relatively mild spring temperature. At 92 degrees, it was merely warm by Texas standards, but scorching for women accustomed to the cooler climate of northern Germany. "Ladies, welcome to Camp Swift," Dawson announced through an interpreter, Captain Karl Weber, a German-American whose parents had emigrated from Munich in 1921. "You will be housed in the east section of the camp. You will find your accommodations simple but adequate. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be fed 3 meals a day. You will have access to medical care. You will be allowed recreational time. You will be expected to work." Elsa Muller translated silently in her head, her English good enough to catch most of the commandant's words without waiting for the interpreter. She had studied English literature at the University of Berlin before the war. Before the party, had redirected her talents to the defense of the fatherland. She noted with professional interest that the American officer spoke plainly, without the flowery rhetoric that characterized military announcements in Germany. "This is propaganda," whispered Helga Schmidt, a sturdy woman from Dresden who had served as a searchlight operator. "They will treat us differently when the cameras leave." There were no cameras, Elsa noticed, just the dusty parade ground, the American soldiers, a surprisingly diverse group, and the vast Texas landscape stretching toward a horizon farther than any she had seen in Europe. As the women were led to their quarters, Elsa noted the construction of the camp. Unlike the efficient uniform design of German military installations, Camp Swift seemed sprawling, almost haphazard in its layout. Yet everything functioned. Supply trucks moved efficiently between buildings. Communication lines were well maintained. The inconsistency of the architecture suggested rapid expansion, as if the camp had grown organically according to need rather than a master plan. The women's barracks were simple but surprisingly comfortable. Each prisoner had her own bed with a real mattress. Thin, but a mattress nonetheless. Clean sheets, a pillow, and a footlocker. Elsa had expected straw pallets at best, possibly the floor. The windows had no bars, though they were screened against the aggressive Texas insects that buzzed incessantly outside. "This is temporary," announced Gerda Weiss, the senior non-commissioned officer among the prisoners. A veteran of the Eastern Front, where she had served as a communications specialist before being transferred to air defense, Gerda had seen the worst of Soviet treatment of prisoners. "They're fattening us up for the newsreels, you'll see." Elsa wasn't so sure. Something about the casual efficiency of the camp bothered her. It lacked the performance aspect of German military presentations. Things were functional rather than impressive. Even Major Dawson's uniform, while clean and proper, lacked the dramatic flair of German officers' attire. His boots were dusty, his demeanor businesslike rather than theatrical. The first meal shocked them all. "This cannot be prisoner rations," said Frida Keller, staring at her tray in the mess hall. "This must be a mistake." The women had been issued trays holding portions of roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, bread with real butter, and apple cobbler for dessert. Each received a large glass of milk and another of water. The quantity was more than many of them had seen in a single meal since before the war. "It's propaganda," Gerda insisted, though she ate every bite. "They're showing off American abundance." "Every day?" questioned Elsa. "To a handful of female prisoners, that seems inefficient." An American guard standing nearby chuckled. "The food? That's just standard army chow, ladies. Nothing special. Wait until Sunday, that's when we get the good stuff." The guard was a young black man, perhaps 20 years old, with an easy smile that seemed incongruous in a prison camp. Private William Jackson, according to his uniform. The German women stared at him, not only because he was black, most had never spoken to a black person before, but because of his casual demeanor. German guards never chatted with prisoners. "I thought Americans segregated their Negro population," Helga whispered to Elsa. "Why is he allowed to guard white prisoners?" Elsa shrugged. The racial policies of America were among the few points where Nazi propaganda found common ground with reality, or so she had believed. Seeing a black soldier in authority, even the limited authority of a guard, contradicted what she had been taught. That first evening, as the women adjusted to their new surroundings, Elsa sat on her bunk, writing in a small notebook the Americans had allowed her to keep. She documented everything: the layout of the camp, the routines, the food, the behavior of the guards. If this was all propaganda, she wanted to record exactly how the Americans constructed their deception. "What will they have us do?" asked Ingrid Brown, a former university student who had volunteered for the Luftwaffe auxiliaries out of patriotic fervor. "Labor camps? Factories?" "I overheard the guards," offered Magda Hoffman, who had been working in the camp kitchen. "They need help on the farms. The men are all away fighting." Elsa nodded. That made sense. America would use them as agricultural labor, replacing the male workers who had gone to war. It was practical, and not violating the Geneva Convention if the conditions were humane. The next morning brought another surprise. After breakfast, eggs, bacon, toast, jam, and coffee with real cream and sugar, the women were assembled in front of the barracks. Major Dawson arrived with a civilian, an older man with weathered skin and calloused hands, that spoke of a lifetime of outdoor work. "Ladies, this is Mr. James Cooper," Dawson announced through the interpreter. "He owns the Cooper Ranch about 5 miles from here. 10 of you will be working there, helping with the spring cattle operations. You'll be paid according to the Geneva Convention, 80 cents per day, which will be credited to your accounts for purchase of personal items from the camp commissary." "Paid?" Elsa exchanged glances with Gerda. German prisoners were not paid for their labor. This had to be more American propaganda. "The rest of you will be assigned to other ranches or to the camp itself, based on your skills and the needs of the area," Dawson continued. "Those assigned to ranches will be transported daily and returned to camp in the evening. You will be under guard, but the guards are there for your protection as much as for security. The local population has lost sons and husbands in this war. Not everyone may understand that you are here as part of official military protocol." Mr. Cooper stepped forward. His face was stern but not unkind. "I need women who aren't afraid of hard work and who can learn quickly. The war has taken all my hands except the ones too old or too young, and we've got 3,000 head of cattle to move to summer pasture." Elsa found herself volunteering, along with 9 others, including Helga, Frida, and surprisingly, Gerda. Whether out of curiosity or a desire to escape the confines of the camp, even the skeptical Gerda seemed eager for the assignment. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., the 10 women selected for the Cooper Ranch were loaded into a canvas-covered truck. They wore their Luftwaffe uniforms, as they had no other clothes, though they had been issued sturdy boots more suitable for ranch work than their military footwear. 2 guards accompanied them, Private Jackson and another soldier, a Native American man who introduced himself as Corporal Ben Whitecloud. "A black man and an Indian," muttered Gerda in German. "They assign us their lowest soldiers." Elsa wasn't so sure. Both men carried themselves with confidence, and both were armed, suggesting they were trusted by their superiors. Still, it fit with what they had been told about American racial hierarchy. The drive to the Cooper Ranch took about 20 minutes. As they traveled, Elsa watched the landscape through a gap in the canvas. The vastness of Texas was disorienting to women, accustomed to the more intimate geography of Germany. Even the sky seemed bigger somehow, stretching from horizon to horizon with a blue intensity that made her dizzy if she looked up too long. The ranch itself was nothing like the neat, orderly farms of Germany. The main house was large but plainly constructed of wooden boards, weathered grey by sun and rain. Outbuildings were scattered without apparent planning. Fences seemed to wander across the landscape, following some logic Elsa couldn't discern. Yet there was purpose in the layout, she realized as they drove closer. The buildings were positioned to catch prevailing winds. The fences followed natural contours of the land. What had seemed haphazard was actually adapted perfectly to the environment. As the truck stopped in the ranch yard, Elsa saw a group of cowboys already mounted on horses, waiting. Most were older men, as Mr. Cooper had said, or boys who couldn't be more than 16. But there were 4 men in their prime years as well, and to the German women's shock, all 4 were black. "Those are your instructors," Mr. Cooper announced as the women climbed down from the truck. "Isaiah Washington is my foreman. He's been with me for 20 years, and he knows more about cattle than any man in 3 counties. These others are Rufus Miller, Samuel Jefferson, and Daniel Brown. They'll teach you what you need to know." The women stood in stunned silence. They were to be instructed by black men who would be giving them orders. Isaiah Washington dismounted and approached. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and hands that could easily wrap around a calf's hindquarters. His face was stern, but his eyes were evaluating, assessing each woman with a professional interest that had nothing to do with their gender or nationality. "None of you ever worked cattle before, I expect," he said, his voice a deep bass that matched his imposing physique. Captain Weber translated, though Isaiah's deliberate speech was clear enough that even those with minimal English could follow much of what he said. "No, sir," Elsa replied in English, surprising herself with the honorific. This man was not an officer, not even a white man, yet something in his demeanor commanded respect. Isaiah nodded, seeming unsurprised by her response. "Cattle work ain't complicated, but it is hard, and it can be dangerous if you don't pay attention. You listen to what we tell you, you'll be fine. You don't, you might get hurt. The cows don't care what color you are or what language you speak. They only understand 2 things, confidence and fear. Show 'em the first, not the second." The day that followed was physically demanding in ways none of the women had anticipated. They were not asked to ride horses. "That takes more time than we've got to teach," Isaiah explained. But they were stationed at critical points around the corral as calves were driven in for branding, vaccination, and ear tagging. Elsa found herself working the gate under Samuel Jefferson's direction. Samuel was younger than Isaiah, perhaps 30, with quick movements and a constant stream of instructions. "Watch the cow, not the calf," he told her. "Mama's the dangerous one. She sees her baby in trouble, she'll come through that gate like a freight train if you let her." By midday, Elsa's arms ached from pushing the heavy gate back and forth. Her uniform was covered in dust and splattered with various unidentifiable substances. She had never been so dirty in her life, not even during the worst bombing raids in Berlin. Yet there was something strangely satisfying about the work. It was straightforward, physical, and the results were immediate. A cow moved where you wanted it to go, or it didn't. There was no ideology in it, no complex motivations. Lunch was served in the shade of a large oak tree. The German women sat together, apart from the cowboys, more from habit than any instruction to do so. To their surprise, the food was identical to what the ranch workers ate: thick sandwiches of roast beef on homemade bread, apples and cookies that Mrs. Cooper had baked that morning, all washed down with cold lemonade. "They eat like this every day?" Helga asked Private Jackson, who was sitting nearby, his rifle propped casually against the tree. Jackson laughed. "Ranch work burns a lot of calories, ma'am. Got to keep your strength up." "Even the Negro workers?" pressed Gerda, her tone making the question more pointed than it might have been. Jackson's smile faded slightly. "Isaiah and his men, they eat what everybody eats. Mr. Cooper doesn't believe in treating folks different based on color. Says all that matters is how well you do your job." This was contrary to everything the women had been taught about America. According to Nazi racial theories, which they had been assured were based on objective science and American practice, Black Americans were an underclass, segregated and subjugated. Yet here were black men not only working alongside whites but supervising German prisoners, women who, in the Nazi racial hierarchy, were among the pinnacle of humanity. The afternoon brought new tasks. The women were split into smaller groups. Elsa, along with Frida and Ingrid, was assigned to help move a herd of cattle from one pasture to another. They were given long sticks and placed along the fence line to prevent strays from breaking away from the main group. Daniel Brown, the youngest of the Black Cowboys, rode alongside them. He couldn't have been more than 25, yet he handled his horse with the casual expertise of someone born to the saddle. When a young heifer tried to dart past Ingrid, who froze in alarm, Daniel spun his horse in a tight circle and headed off the animal, driving it back to the herd with a few precisely calculated movements. "You got to make noise," he called to Ingrid, demonstrating by slapping his leg with his hat. "Let 'em know you're there. They can't see too good, but they hear just fine." Ingrid nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment at her failure. She had been a top student at her university, accustomed to succeeding at whatever she attempted. The simple task of moving a cow from one place to another had defeated her. "Don't worry about it," Daniel said, seeing her expression. "First time I tried to move a cow, I ended up in the creek with a busted arm. You're doing better than I did." His casual kindness seemed to confuse Ingrid more than his instructions had. She had expected contempt, especially from a man she had been taught to consider inferior. Instead, he was treating her as he might any novice, with patience and practical advice. By the end of the day, the German women were exhausted, filthy, and in many cases nursing minor injuries, bruises from bumping into frightened cattle, small cuts from barbed wire fences, and in Helga's case, a spectacular coating of mud from falling into a water trough. Yet there was also a sense of accomplishment. They had completed actual work, contributed something tangible to the operation of the ranch. On the drive back to Camp Swift, the women were quieter than they had been that morning. The physical demands of the day had drained much of their energy, but Elsa noticed something else as well. The rigid military posture, the Luftwaffe discipline that had characterized their group, had softened somewhat. They sat slumped on the truck's benches, no longer concerned with maintaining appearances. "They're not what I expected," Frida said quietly in German. "The Americans?" asked Elsa. "The Negro men," Frida clarified. "They know so much, and they speak to us as if we're just people who don't know about cattle." "We are just people who don't know about cattle," Elsa pointed out. "You know what I mean," Frida insisted. "In their position with us as prisoners, wouldn't you expect, I don't know, some resentment, some attempt to make us feel inferior? That's what I would feel, I think." Elsa considered this. It was true. If their positions were reversed, if Black American prisoners were sent to work under German supervision, the treatment would have been very different. The racial doctrines that permeated German society wouldn't have permitted the kind of professional respect they had received today. "Perhaps they're under orders," suggested Gerda, ever the skeptic. "Part of the propaganda. Show the German prisoners how well America treats people of different races." "To what end?" countered Elsa. "We're just a handful of women. What purpose would such an elaborate deception serve?" Gerda had no answer for that. The routine continued for the next several days. Each morning the women were transported to Cooper Ranch. Each evening they returned to Camp Swift. The work varied. Some days they helped with the cattle, other days they repaired fences or cleared brush. Always, the Black Cowboys provided instruction, correction when needed, and occasional praise when they mastered a skill. On the fourth day, as they were taking their lunch break, Elsa found herself sitting near Isaiah Washington. The foreman was eating alone, slightly apart from both the cowboys and the prisoners. On impulse, Elsa moved to sit nearby, not directly beside him, but close enough for conversation. "May I ask you something, Mr. Washington?" she said in her careful English. Isaiah looked up, his expression neutral. "You can ask." "How long have you been a cowboy?" The question seemed to surprise him. Perhaps he had expected something more confrontational. "Since I was 12 years old. That's 41 years now." "And you learned from your father?" Isaiah shook his head. "My father was a slave in Louisiana. Never saw a cow that wasn't pulling a plow. I was born free, just after the Civil War. Came to Texas when I was 10 with my mama, after my daddy died. Got hired on as a water boy for a cattle drive. Learned the rest as I went." Elsa tried to process this information. This imposing man, with his confident authority and extensive knowledge, had begun life as the child of a slave. In Germany, such a background would have defined and limited him permanently. Yet here he was, a respected foreman on a substantial ranch, supervising white workers and German military prisoners. Do you experience much prejudice?" she asked, feeling her way carefully through the English words. "Because of your color?" Isaiah's gaze was steady, evaluating her sincerity. "Every day of my life," he said finally. "There are places I can't go, things I can't do. When I ride into town with Mr. Cooper, I don't eat in the same restaurants or stay in the same hotels. My children go to a different school than his grandchildren, though they live on the same ranch." "Then how—" Elsa gestured vaguely at the ranch, the cattle, the operation that Isaiah clearly managed with authority. "How am I the foreman here?" Isaiah finished for her. He took a drink from his canteen before answering. "Because out here what matters is what you can do, not what color you are. Mr. Cooper's daddy hired my daddy when no one else would give a former slave a chance. When I showed I could handle cattle better than most, he made me foreman. Not because he doesn't have prejudice. He does, same as most white folks, but because he's a practical man running a business. He needs the best people doing the work, and out here I'm the best at what I do." Elsa absorbed this. It contradicted Nazi racial doctrine at its most fundamental level. According to what she had been taught, a black man could never excel beyond the capabilities of even the most mediocre white person. Yet here was clear evidence that Isaiah Washington was exceptional at his work, regardless of his race, and that practical reality had overcome racial ideology, at least in this context. "In Germany," she said slowly, "such a thing would not be possible." "So I've heard," Isaiah replied. His tone wasn't accusatory, merely factual. "Though I expect Germany has its contradictions too. Most places do." Before Elsa could respond, Mr. Cooper called for the afternoon work to begin. She returned to her assigned task, but Isaiah's words stayed with her throughout the day. That evening in the barracks, the conversation among the women centered on their experiences at the ranch. The initial shock of working under black supervision had given way to a reluctant respect for the cowboys' expertise. Even Gerda, who maintained her ideological stance most rigidly, acknowledged that Isaiah Washington knew his business. "It's a different context," she argued. "Ranch work is primitive, physical. Naturally, people adapted to physical labor would excel at it." "Isaiah reads 3 newspapers a day," Elsa countered. "I saw them in his saddlebag. He was discussing the progress of the Allied campaign in Italy with Mr. Cooper in considerable detail." This information created a moment of uncomfortable silence. It didn't fit the framework that most of the women were still trying to maintain, that what they were witnessing was either propaganda or an isolated exception that didn't challenge the broader racial theories they had been taught. "I spoke with Samuel about his family," offered Frida. "He has a son who's a doctor in Chicago, a Negro doctor. He showed me a photograph." Another piece that didn't fit the narrative they had brought with them across the Atlantic. 2 weeks into their time at Cooper Ranch, an incident occurred that would force a more profound reassessment. The women had become reasonably competent at basic cattle handling tasks. On this particular day, they were helping move a herd to a new pasture, with Elsa, Helga, and Gerda positioned along a fence line to keep stragglers from breaking away. The day was hotter than usual, with temperatures reaching 100 degrees by mid-morning. The cattle were irritable in the heat, and the entire operation was proceeding slowly. Isaiah had warned everyone to stay alert, as heat made the animals unpredictable. Elsa was focused on a cow that seemed determined to find a way through the fence rather than follow the herd. She didn't notice when a bull, separated from the main group, began pawing the ground behind her. Her first warning was a shout from Daniel, who was riding nearby. "Elsa, don't move!" She froze, then slowly turned her head. The bull was about 30 yards away, its head lowered, eyes fixed on her. She had been trained to face bombing raids, but this was a different kind of danger altogether, primitive and immediate. "Back away slow," Daniel called, his voice deliberately calm. "Don't run. I'm coming around behind him." Elsa began to step backward, keeping her movements measured despite the fear that urged her to flee. Daniel was circling wide, trying to get behind the bull without further agitating it, but the animal was already committed to its charge. With a bellow that seemed to shake the ground, it lunged forward. What happened next occurred so quickly that Elsa would later have trouble recalling the exact sequence. Daniel spurred his horse directly into the bull's path. The horse, well trained but still terrified, balked slightly, giving the bull time to swerve and catch its shoulder. Horse and rider went down in a tangle of limbs. The bull, momentum carrying it forward, charged past them toward Elsa, who stood frozen in shock. Then another rider flashed between them, Samuel Jefferson, his horse moving like an extension of his own body. He slapped the bull hard across the face with his coiled rope, diverting its attention. The bull turned to face this new threat, giving Elsa time to scramble to safety behind the fence. Isaiah and Rufus arrived seconds later, helping to drive the bull back toward the herd. Mr. Cooper and Corporal Whitecloud hurried to where Daniel lay beside his horse. The young cowboy was conscious but clearly in pain, clutching his leg which bent at an unnatural angle. "Broken, mister," Cooper pronounced after a quick examination. "Ben, take my truck and get him to the doctor in town. Isaiah, get these cattle moved before we have another incident." As Corporal Whitecloud helped Daniel into the truck, Elsa approached them. "He saved my life," she said, still shaking from the encounter. "He put himself in danger for me." Daniel grimaced through his pain. "Just doing my job. Ma'am, you'd have done the same for me." Would she? Elsa wasn't certain. She had been taught that preserving German lives was paramount, that the lives of others, especially those deemed racially inferior, were of less value. Yet this young black man had risked his life without hesitation for a German prisoner, an enemy. The rest of the day passed in subdued activity. The cattle were successfully moved to their new pasture, but Daniel's injury cast a shadow over the accomplishment. When they returned to the ranch yard, Mr. Cooper assembled everyone for an announcement. "Daniel's at the hospital. Doctor says he'll be laid up for at least 6 weeks with that broken leg. That puts us in a tight spot for the summer roundup." He surveyed the German women thoughtfully. "You ladies have been quick learners. Isaiah says some of you show real promise. I'm going to ask for permission to extend your work detail and increase your responsibilities. Those who are willing will learn to ride. We need every hand we can get." The proposal was unexpected. Learning to ride horses, taking on more skilled work, this went beyond the simple labor they had anticipated. It implied a level of trust that seemed incongruous with their status as prisoners of war. Back at Camp Swift that evening, Major Dawson confirmed the arrangement. "Mr. Cooper has requested that your detachment continue at his ranch with expanded duties. Given the labor shortage and the good reports of your work so far, I've approved the request. This remains voluntary. Anyone who doesn't wish to continue can be reassigned to other duties." All 10 women volunteered to continue. Whatever their ideological reservations, the ranch work had provided a freedom and sense of purpose that made it preferable to the alternatives. The next phase of their experience at Cooper Ranch began with riding lessons. The women were each assigned a horse suited to their size and temperament. Elsa's was a chestnut mare named Penny, older and steady, but still spirited enough to respond quickly when needed. Isaiah supervised their training, with Samuel and Rufus demonstrating techniques and providing individual instruction. The German women proved adept students, their military discipline translating well to the structured commands of horsemanship. Within a week, most could ride well enough for basic cattle work. though they lacked the intuitive connection with their mounts that the experienced cowboys displayed. During this period, something subtle began to change in the dynamic between the German prisoners and their black instructors. The shared experience of learning a challenging skill, the necessary physical proximity as the cowboys adjusted stirrups or demonstrated how to properly hold the reins, and the growing mutual respect as the women mastered the basics of riding, all combined to erode the artificial barriers that ideology had constructed. Elsa noticed the change first in herself. She no longer thought of Isaiah, Samuel, and Rufus primarily as black cowboys, but as individuals with distinct personalities, skills, and backgrounds. Isaiah was methodical, patient, but demanding. Samuel had a quick humor that surfaced unexpectedly. Rufus was the quietest of the three, but noticed everything and could anticipate problems before they developed. She observed similar shifts in her fellow prisoners. Helga, initially the most uncomfortable with black authority, now asked Samuel detailed questions about cattle breeding techniques. Frida had begun collecting recipes from Mrs. Cooper, determined to master Texas-style biscuits. Even Gerda, though she maintained a certain reserve, had stopped making comments about racial hierarchy. The most dramatic transformation, however, was in Ingrid. The former university student had discovered a natural affinity for horses. Under Rufus's tutelage, she had progressed from basic riding to more advanced skills with remarkable speed. Her academic mind, accustomed to absorbing and systematizing information, applied itself to the nuances of horsemanship with the same intensity she had once devoted to her studies. "She's got a gift," Rufus told Elsa as they watched Ingrid successfully cut a single calf from a group, a maneuver that required precise coordination between rider and horse. "Some folks take years to develop that kind of feel for a horse. She picked it up in weeks." Ingrid's face glowed with accomplishment as she guided her mount back to where they stood. It was an expression Elsa hadn't seen since before the war, before ideology had narrowed the acceptable avenues for female achievement to service to the Reich. "Mr. Miller says I'm ready to help with the actual roundup," Ingrid announced, using Rufus's surname with the formal respect she would have given a German instructor. "You'll do fine," Rufus affirmed with a nod. "Just remember to trust your horse. She knows this work better than you do." The summer roundup began in late June. It was the major operation of the ranching year, gathering cattle scattered across thousands of acres, counting them, branding the new calves, and preparing the selected portion of the herd for sale. For the German women, now nearly 2 months into their time at Cooper Ranch, it represented a test of everything they had learned. The work was grueling. Days began before sunrise and often ended after sunset. The heat was oppressive, regularly exceeding 100 degrees. Dust coated everything. Skin, clothing, food, water became precious, carried in canteens that were never quite full enough. The women's Luftwaffe uniforms, already modified with pieces of civilian clothing for practicality, became unrecognizable beneath layers of dirt, sweat, and cattle grime. Yet amid the hardship, Elsa observed a remarkable phenomenon. The artificial divisions, between prisoners and guards, between Germans and Americans, between white and black, receded in the face of the immediate challenges. When a sudden thunderstorm scattered a portion of the herd, it didn't matter who rode alongside whom to gather the frightened cattle. When Helga's horse stepped in a gopher hole and threw her, the closest riders, Samuel and Private Jackson, were the ones who helped her, regardless of color or nationality. One evening, as they camped on the range rather than returning to the ranch, Elsa found herself sitting beside the fire with Isaiah, Samuel, Rufus, Corporal Whitecloud, and several of the German women. The day's work had been particularly challenging, with several head of cattle lost in a wooded ravine that took hours to search. Everyone was exhausted, but satisfied with the eventual success. The conversation, as it often did, turned to comparisons between Texas and Germany, between ranching and other occupations, between peacetime and war. The German women, now sufficiently confident in their English to manage without Captain Weber's translation, participated actively. "In Germany," Frida was explaining, "farms are much smaller. Everything is more contained. You would never have this. She gestured at the vast landscape surrounding them, visible in the moonlight that silvered the prairie grass to the distant horizon. "Must make it easier to keep track of your cattle," Samuel observed with a smile. "But less freedom for them," Ingrid said. Then, realizing the implication of her words, she fell silent, her face flushed in the firelight. Isaiah studied her thoughtfully. "Freedom's a funny thing," he said after a moment. "Looks different depending on where you're standing. These cattle got thousands of acres to roam, but they're still owned. Still get branded, counted, sold when it suits the owner." The parallel was too obvious to need stating. Isaiah, born to parents who had been property, understood the complexities of freedom in ways the German women were only beginning to grasp. "In Germany, we were taught that America is—" Elsa hesitated, searching for a diplomatic phrasing. "Hypocritical," Isaiah supplied. "Preaching freedom while practicing slavery and segregation?" Elsa nodded, relieved that he had said it rather than her. "It's true enough," Isaiah acknowledged. "I can't vote in Texas, can't eat in the same restaurants as white folks. My children go to separate schools. That's the reality." "Then why do you fight for America?" Gerda asked, her tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "Your son is in the army," you said. "Why would he risk his life for a country that treats him as inferior?" Isaiah took his time answering, poking the fire with a stick and watching the sparks rise toward the star-filled Texas sky. "My grandfather was a slave until he was 50 years old," he said finally. "Never owned himself for most of his life. My father was born in slavery but died a free man with his own piece of land. My son is a sergeant in an all-black unit, fighting fascism overseas. That's 3 generations, each one with more freedom than the last. It's not enough and it's not fast enough, but it's movement in the right direction." He looked directly at Gerda. "What direction is Germany moving?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. The German women had all seen the direction, the steadily increasing restrictions, the disappearances, the shift from national pride to militant expansionism, the replacement of law with the arbitrary will of the Führer. None of them had fully supported all aspects of Nazi policy, but as with most Germans, they had accepted the incremental changes, adjusting to each new reality until they found themselves serving a regime whose logical endpoint was incompatible with their own values. "I wanted to be a professor," Ingrid said into the silence. "Literature. But the university said women should focus on motherhood and supporting German men. So I joined the auxiliaries instead, thinking at least I could serve some purpose. I was studying engineering," added Frida. "They closed the program to women in 1940, said our minds weren't suited to technical subjects, but then they needed us to operate the anti-aircraft systems, which require complex calculations and technical understanding." The contradictions of Nazi gender policy, simultaneously glorifying traditional motherhood while requiring women's service in previously male domains, had become increasingly difficult to reconcile as the war progressed. "My brother was in the Hitler Youth," Helga said quietly. "He came home talking about things that I couldn't believe Germans would do. But when I questioned it, my parents told me to be silent, that it was dangerous to speak against the party. One by one, the German women shared their experiences, small moments of doubt, of recognition that something had gone wrong in their country, that the grand promises of national renewal had transformed into something darker than they had anticipated. None had been active resistors, but neither had they been true believers. Like most Germans, they had accommodated themselves to each stage of the regime, finding ways to justify or ignore what they could not accept. Isaiah and the other Americans listened without judgment. This was not an interrogation or a demand for denazification, merely a conversation around a campfire, between people who had worked alongside each other, long enough to develop a measure of trust. "America's got plenty wrong with it," Isaiah said when they had finished. "But here's the difference I see. In America, the idea is right, even when the practice is wrong. All men are created equal. That's the foundation. We fail to live up to it every day, but the idea stands as a challenge, a direction to move toward. When I argue for my rights, I'm not asking America to be something different than it claims to be. I'm asking it to be what it says it already is." It was a perspective that none of the German women had considered. Their education under the Nazi regime had portrayed American ideals as mere hypocrisy, a smokescreen for capitalist exploitation and racial subjugation. Isaiah was suggesting something more complex, a nation failing to fully embody its founding principles, but with those principles still serving as a mechanism for progress. The roundup continued for another week. By the time it concluded, the German women had proven themselves capable ranch hands. They had learned to ride, to rope, to move cattle effectively across varied terrain. They had endured physical hardships, overcome fears, and developed skills that none could have imagined possessing when they arrived at Camp Swift. More significantly, they had developed relationships with the Americans, black, white, and Native American, that transcended the categories assigned by ideology. They had shared meals, stories, hardships, and occasional moments of unexpected joy, like the evening when Samuel brought out a harmonica and played while Ingrid revealed a surprisingly good singing voice. On the final day of the roundup, as they drove the last group of cattle into the home pasture, Mr. Cooper rode alongside Elsa. "You ladies have done good work," he said, his weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Better than I expected, if I'm being honest." "Thank you, sir," Elsa replied, now comfortable enough on horseback to maintain a conversation while riding. "We have had excellent teachers." Cooper nodded. "Isaiah's the best there is, the others too. You listening to them is what made the difference." "In Germany," Elsa said carefully, "we would not have been asked to listen to black instructors." "Their loss," Cooper said simply. Then, after a moment, "What was it like in Germany before the war?" Elsa considered the question. It wasn't one the Americans usually asked. It was hopeful at first. After the Depression, after the humiliation of Versailles, there was a sense that Germany was regaining its pride. Things were improving. New roads, new buildings, new opportunities. It seemed that the chaos was over, that there was direction and purpose again. "And then," Cooper prompted when she fell silent. "And then it changed," Elsa said. "Gradually, then suddenly, friends disappeared, books were burned, questions became dangerous, but by then, it was too late to object. The systems were in place. The consequences for dissent were severe." Cooper was quiet for a long moment, squinting at the horizon where a bank of clouds suggested a coming storm. "My daddy fought in the Civil War," he said finally. "Union side, though his family was from Virginia. Said he figured out pretty quick it wasn't about states' rights like some claimed. It was about whether human beings could own other human beings. Said once you saw it that clearly, there wasn't any choice about which side to be on." He looked back at Elsa. "Isaiah told me about your conversation around the campfire, about Germany's direction. Sounds like you're seeing things more clearly now." Before Elsa could respond, they were interrupted by a shout from one of the young cowboys. A section of fence had broken, and several cattle were already heading for the gap. Cooper spurred his horse toward the problem, the conversation left unfinished. That evening, back at Camp Swift, the women gathered in their barracks. 2 months of outdoor work had transformed them physically. Their skin was tanned, their muscles hardened, their movements more confident. But the more significant changes were internal. "I received a letter from my mother," Gerda announced. The mail service for prisoners was slow and censored, but functional. "She writes that Berlin is being bombed daily now, food is scarce, and—" She hesitated. "She mentions that our neighbor, Mrs. Steinberg, went away." Mrs. Steinberg was Jewish. The implication hung silently in the room. They all knew what "went away" likely meant. Reports had reached them even before their capture, whispered accounts of camps in the east, of mass deportations, of atrocities that seemed too terrible to be credible. They had not discussed these rumors among themselves, finding it easier to focus on their immediate circumstances than to contemplate what might be happening in their homeland. "I keep thinking about what Isaiah said," Frida ventured after a moment, "about America moving in the right direction, even if too slowly. And then I think about Germany." "We didn't know," Helga insisted. "We couldn't have known what would happen." "Didn't we?" Elsa challenged gently. "The principles were clear from the beginning. Racial hierarchy, German supremacy, the subordination of individual rights to the will of the state, the glorification of violence. Where else could such principles lead? It was a question none of them had allowed themselves to ask, even privately. Their military service, their focus on defending German cities from Allied bombing, had provided a moral clarity that obscured the larger ethical implications of the regime they served. "I've been thinking about power," Ingrid said, her academic mind still inclined toward theoretical formulations, despite months of practical ranch work. "What makes a nation truly powerful? We were taught it was racial purity, military strength, the unity of the Volk under a strong leader." She gestured around them at the simple but comfortable barracks, at the camp beyond, at the vast Texas landscape beyond that. "But look at America. It's a mixture of races and nationalities. Its military uses black soldiers and Indian scouts. Its government is deliberately divided to prevent a single leader from having too much control. By all the principles we were taught, it should be weak, chaotic, ineffective. Yet, they're winning the war," Frida concluded, "not just with weapons, but with production, with resources, with systems that function despite their apparent inefficiency." It was true. The evidence surrounded them, from the abundance of food despite rationing, to the quality of equipment, to the seemingly endless supply of vehicles, fuel, and materials. Germany had achieved early victories through discipline, tactical brilliance, and the element of surprise. But America was winning through sheer productive capacity, through systems of organization that didn't require racial homogeneity or absolute central control to function effectively. "I asked Isaiah why he doesn't hate us," Helga said, "as Germans, as enemies, as people who believe in racial hierarchy. He said something I can't forget. He said, 'Hate doesn't build anything worth keeping.'" The women contemplated this wisdom, so contrary to the foundation of the regime they had served, which had built its power on cultivated resentment and manufactured hatred. "What will we do?" asked Frida. "After the war? When we return to Germany?" It was the first time any of them had directly addressed the future, the eventuality of Germany's defeat, and their return to a homeland transformed by war and occupation. "We'll rebuild," Elsa said firmly. "Not what was, but something better, something moving in the right direction." The others nodded, the shared experience of the past months having forged a unity of purpose that transcended their previous identities as Luftwaffe auxiliaries. They had arrived as prisoners, defined by their nationality and military service. They would return as individuals who had glimpsed an alternative to the ideological certainties they had been taught, who had learned to evaluate people by their character and actions rather than by predetermined categories. The summer passed, and with it came changes to the German prisoners' situation. As Allied forces advanced across France following the June invasion, the strategic value of female Luftwaffe auxiliaries as intelligence sources diminished. Regulations regarding their employment were relaxed further. By August, the women were spending 6 days a week at Cooper Ranch, returning to Camp Swift only for Sunday rest and administrative requirements. They had become integral to the ranch operation, particularly after 3 more of Mr. Cooper's remaining cowboys were drafted into military service. The relationships between the German women and the black cowboys had evolved from instructor-student to something approaching professional colleagues. Isaiah still directed the overall operation, but he now assigned tasks with confidence that they would be executed properly, whether by Samuel, Rufus, or Ingrid and the other German women. On a sweltering August afternoon, as they were repairing a section of fence far from the main ranch buildings, Elsa found herself working alongside Samuel. They had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, with Samuel setting posts while Elsa strung the wire between them. "My son wrote me last week," Samuel said as they worked. "He's in France now, with an engineering unit. Building bridges faster than the Germans can blow them up, he says." Elsa smiled at the pride in his voice. "He sounds very capable." "Always was," Samuel agreed. "Even as a boy, always figuring out how things work, putting them back together better than they were before. His mother and I saved everything we could to send him to college. Wasn't easy. Not many medical schools take Negro students." "But he succeeded," Elsa observed, threading wire through a post. "He did. Now he's a captain in the army. When I was his age, they wouldn't even let Negroes be officers. Samuel drove another post into the hard Texas ground with powerful strokes of the post hole digger. That's what I mean about direction. Slow progress, but progress. Elsa wiped sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. When I return to Germany, everything will be different. Cities destroyed, government overthrown, foreign occupation. She pulled the wire taut and secured it. An opportunity to build something new, but also great hardship. Samuel nodded. Hardship I understand. My grandparents were slaves. My parents were sharecroppers. Barely a step up. I've worked from sunup to sundown every day of my life. But my son is a doctor and an officer. My daughter teaches school in Houston. That's how you measure progress. Not by where you are, but by the distance you've traveled and the direction you're moving. It was a perspective that offered hope amid the certainty of Germany's defeat. Not a return to some mythical past greatness, but the patient building of something better, measured across generations rather than political cycles. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. Mr. Cooper's truck bumped across the rough pasture toward them, raising a cloud of dust visible long before the vehicle itself came into view. When it stopped nearby, Cooper and Major Dawson stepped out. "Lieutenant Müller," Dawson called to Elsa, "word just came through from the War Department. Germany has begun using V-2 rockets against London, supersonic weapons that can't be intercepted. They're asking for any prisoners with knowledge of German rocketry programs to volunteer for technical interviews." Elsa set down her wire cutters. Her specialization in the Luftwaffe had been communications, not weapons systems. But she had friends who had worked at Peenemünde, the German rocket development center. She had heard rumors of the vengeance weapons being developed to turn the tide of the war. "I have limited knowledge, sir," she said, "but I will share what I know." Dawson nodded. "We're not asking you to betray your country, Lieutenant, but these rockets are being used against civilian targets. They're terror weapons, not military ones." The distinction was important to Elsa. Her service had been in defense of German cities against Allied bombing. The idea of weapons specifically designed to terrorize civilian populations violated her understanding of honorable warfare. "I understand, sir. When do you need me to report?" "There's a briefing team arriving from Washington tomorrow. They'll want to speak with you and any others who have relevant information." Dawson's expression was grave. "This isn't an interrogation, Lieutenant. It's a technical consultation. Your cooperation will be noted in your record." As Cooper and Dawson returned to the truck, Samuel resumed his work on the fence post. "Rockets that can't be stopped," he mused. "That's something to think about." "They won't change the outcome," Elsa said with certainty. "Germany has innovation, but America has production. 1,000 rockets won't match 1,000,000 bombs." Samuel gave her a thoughtful look. "You sound pretty sure about which side you're on." The observation startled her. "I'm still a German officer." "Course you are," Samuel agreed easily. "But you're seeing things clearer now, like Mr. Cooper's daddy in the Civil War. Once you see clearly, there's not much choice about which side to be on." The next morning, Elsa and 3 other women with technical knowledge were transported to the administrative section of Camp Swift for interviews with the team from Washington. The briefing officers were respectful, emphasizing that their participation was voluntary and would be considered favorably when repatriation was eventually arranged. The interviews lasted several days. Elsa provided what information she had about German rocket programs, mostly second-hand knowledge from conversations with friends, but still valuable for the American analysts trying to understand the new threat. The other women, including a former mathematics instructor who had worked on trajectory calculations, contributed more detailed technical information. When they returned to Cooper Ranch the following week, Elsa sensed a subtle change in how the Americans regarded them. There was a new respect, an acknowledgement that they had chosen to assist rather than withhold information that might save civilian lives. "Heard you helped our folks understand those rocket things," Isaiah commented as they rode out to check on a distant section of the herd. "Can't have been an easy decision." Elsa adjusted her hat against the brilliant Texas sun. "Easier than you might think. Weapons against soldiers, that's war. Weapons designed only for civilians, that's something else." Isaiah nodded, his expression somber. War makes people do things they never thought they would, good and bad. I keep thinking about what comes after, Elsa admitted. Germany will lose, I know that now. Then what? How do we rebuild not just buildings, but principles? Trust? How do we find a direction we can believe in again? They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creaking of saddle leather and the rhythmic hoofbeats of their horses. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful, rolling hills covered with drought-resistant grasses, scattered oak trees providing rare shade, the vast dome of the Texas sky arching overhead. After slavery ended, Isaiah said finally, my people were free but had nothing. No land, no education, no protection. Everything had to be built from nothing, and there were plenty who wanted to make sure we couldn't build at all. He pointed to the distant horizon. But we did build. Families, communities, churches, schools when they'd let us have them, our own schools when they wouldn't. It wasn't fast and it wasn't easy, still isn't finished, but each generation did what they could, moving things forward a little, making things a little better for the next. The wisdom in his words resonated with Elsa. The challenge facing post-war Germany would be immense. Physical reconstruction, economic revival, political reformation, and most difficult of all, moral and ethical recalibration. It couldn't be accomplished quickly or through sweeping ideological pronouncements like those that had seduced Germany into its current catastrophe. Small steps in the right direction, she murmured. Isaiah smiled. That's all any of us can do. As summer gave way to fall, news of the war's progress reached Camp Swift regularly. Allied forces were advancing across France. Russian troops were driving toward Germany from the east. The outcome was becoming increasingly apparent to even the most optimistic German prisoners. For the women working at Cooper Ranch, the daily routine continued regardless of the strategic situation. Cattle needed tending. Fences required repair, and the 1,000 tasks of ranch operation didn't pause for geopolitical developments. There was comfort in the consistency of the work, in the tangible results of their efforts. In late September, they helped with the fall cattle sale, driving selected portions of the herd to the railhead for transport to market. It was the culmination of the season's work, the economic payoff for months of effort. As the cattle were loaded onto railroad cars, Mr. Cooper approached Elsa, Isaiah, and the others who had overseen the operation. "Best price I've gotten in years," he announced, his usual taciturn manner softened by satisfaction. "War creates demand, I suppose, though I'd prefer prosperity by other means." He looked over the German women, now indistinguishable from American ranch hands in their attire and demeanor, except for the small PW letters stenciled on their work clothes. "According to the terms approved by Major Dawson, you ladies get a bonus based on the sale results. It'll be credited to your accounts at the camp commissary." The arrangement was another departure from what the women had expected as prisoners of war. Not only were they paid for their labor according to the Geneva Convention, but they now received performance bonuses like regular employees. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper," Elsa responded for the group. "It has been educational, working for you." Cooper almost smiled, a rare expression for the reserved rancher. "Isaiah tells me you've been talking a lot about America, about what makes it work, despite all the things that don't make sense on paper." Elsa nodded. "I've been trying to understand." Cooper leaned against the railroad car, watching the last of his cattle being loaded. "My grandfather fought in the Texas Revolution against Mexico. My father fought in the Civil War against other Americans. I fought in the Spanish-American War. My son died in the Great War in France. Now my grandson is in the Pacific fighting the Japanese." He turned to look directly at Elsa. 5 generations of Coopers fighting in 5 different wars. You know what we were all fighting for? The same thing, the idea that people ought to be able to decide for themselves how to live, who to follow, what to believe. We haven't always gotten it right. We've made plenty of mistakes, some of them terrible ones. But the idea remains. Elsa thought about this legacy of service across generations, each fighting for principles rather than mere territorial expansion or resource acquisition. It contrasted sharply with the German military tradition that had evolved from Prussian discipline and efficiency into the service of ideological conquest. In Germany, she said. "We were taught that America is weak because it lacks unity of purpose, because it allows dissent and disorder, because it has no single vision guiding it." Cooper snorted. "Unity's overrated. Bunch of people all thinking exactly the same way. That's not strength, that's just being stuck. America's messy, always has been, people arguing, disagreeing, working things out as they go. But when something truly threatens those basic ideas we believe in, we come together well enough." He gestured at the cattle now fully loaded on the train. "Like these cows. They're individuals, each one going its own way if left alone. Getting them to move together takes work, but once they're moving in the same direction, there's power in it. Not because they're all the same, but because they're all heading towards something better." It was perhaps the longest speech Elsa had ever heard from the laconic rancher. His perspective, practical rather than theoretical, grounded in generational experience rather than abstract ideology, carried a weight that academic arguments lacked. As fall deepened toward winter, changes came to Camp Swift. With the Allied advance continuing in Europe, resources were being redirected. The prison camp population fluctuated as new German prisoners arrived from the front lines, while others were transferred to different facilities. In early November, Major Dawson summoned the women who had been working at Cooper Ranch to his office. His expression was serious as they assembled before his desk. "Ladies, I've received new directives from the War Department," he announced without preamble. "As part of the reorganization of prisoner facilities, Camp Swift will be transitioning to housing primarily male combat personnel. The female contingent, including yourselves, will be transferred to Fort Bliss near El Paso." The news was unexpected and unwelcome. After nearly 6 months at Cooper Ranch, the women had established a routine, developed skills, and formed relationships. The prospect of starting over at a new facility was disheartening. "When will this happen, sir?" Elsa asked. "Transport is scheduled for next week." Dawson's tone softened slightly. "I've included commendations in all your files for your work here. It will be noted when repatriation arrangements are eventually made." Elsa glanced at her companions. Ingrid looked particularly stricken at the news. The former university student had found an unexpected fulfillment in ranch work, her academic mind adapting to the practical challenges of cattle management with surprising aptitude. "Sir," Elsa ventured, "is there any possibility of an alternative arrangement? The work at Cooper Ranch is ongoing, and Mr. Cooper has come to rely on our assistance." Dawson frowned. "This is a military decision, Lieutenant. Cooper Ranch's staffing concerns are not the Army's priority." "I understand that, sir, but considering the labor shortage and our demonstrated reliability, perhaps an exception could be considered, for the benefit of the local economy, if nothing else." The Major studied her for a long moment. "I'll speak with Mr. Cooper. If he's willing to assume greater responsibility for your supervision, with reduced military oversight, there might be a compromise arrangement possible, but I make no promises." It was a small opening, but Elsa seized it. "Thank you, sir. We appreciate your consideration." When they informed the ranch personnel of the potential transfer, the reaction was surprisingly strong. Isaiah immediately went to speak with Mr. Cooper. Samuel and Rufus discussed how the ranch operation would need to be restructured if the women left. Even the younger Cowboys, initially suspicious of the German prisoners, now expressed concern about losing their assistance. "Cooper's gone to speak with Major Dawson directly," Isaiah informed them the next day. "Says the fall planting can't be delayed regardless of what the War Department has scheduled." 2 days later, Mr. Cooper himself delivered the news as they gathered for lunch. "You ladies are staying," he announced without ceremony. "I've worked out an arrangement with the Army. You'll be housed here at the ranch instead of returning to camp each night. There'll be one guard assigned, rotating weekly. The Army saves on transport costs and guard details. I get reliable workers. Everybody wins." The announcement was met with relief and enthusiasm from both the German women and the ranch staff. The arrangement represented yet another step away from their identity as prisoners and toward a status more like guest workers. The transition to living at the ranch, rather than the camp, accelerated the integration of the German women into the daily life and culture of rural Texas. Mrs. Cooper, a practical woman in her 60s who had previously had limited interaction with the prisoners, now became a significant presence in their lives. She supervised the conversion of a storage building into suitable women's quarters, instructed them in American cooking techniques, and gradually included them in the social aspects of ranch life. "You girls need proper clothes," she declared, surveying their worn Luftwaffe uniforms, supplemented with miscellaneous American garments. "Can't have you looking like scarecrows if you're living here." A trip to the nearest town resulted in the acquisition of appropriate clothing, practical dresses, work pants, shirts and boots, sized for women rather than the men's attire they had been adapting. The simple dignity of wearing proper civilian clothing, selected for themselves rather than issued by authorities, had a subtle but significant impact on the women's self-perception. As their status evolved, so too did their understanding of American society. Living at the ranch provided opportunities to observe interactions between various groups that had not been visible at Camp Swift. They saw how Isaiah and the other black cowboys navigated the complex racial landscape. Respected for their skills on the ranch, but subject to restrictions and indignities when they went into town. They witnessed the casual discrimination faced by Corporal Whitecloud when he visited, despite his military service. Yet they also observed instances of respect and cooperation that contradicted the monolithic picture of American racism portrayed in Nazi propaganda. Mr. Cooper defended his workers against disrespectful treatment, not from ideological commitment to equality, but from practical recognition of their value and personal loyalty, developed over years of working together. When a store owner in town tried to refuse service to Rufus, Cooper threatened to take all his considerable business elsewhere, an economic argument that proved persuasive. The ranch itself became a microcosm where different rules applied, not perfect equality, but a system based primarily on competence and contribution rather than predetermined categories. Isaiah's authority as foreman was respected by everyone, including the white cowboys and the German women, because it was earned through demonstrated expertise and consistent results. For Elsa and her companions, this experience provided a model for what might be possible in post-war Germany, not a utopian transformation, but a practical system where people were evaluated primarily by their actions and abilities, rather than by ideology or ancestry. As Christmas approached, the ranch prepared for the holiday with traditions both familiar and unfamiliar to the German women. Mrs. Cooper organized the decoration of the main house with evergreen boughs, ribbons, and handmade ornaments. A large tree was set up in the living room, reminiscent of the German Tannenbaum tradition, but with distinctly American touches. "We always have a big dinner on Christmas Eve," Mrs. Cooper explained, as she enlisted the German women's help in preparations. "Family, workers, neighbors, everyone's welcome. Then midnight service at the church in town for those who want to go." The idea of celebrating Christmas openly with religious observance was somewhat startling to the German women. Under the Nazi regime, traditional Christian Christmas had been gradually supplanted by Julfest, a secularized version emphasizing Germanic traditions rather than Christian ones. Religious expression had become increasingly restricted, particularly for those in military service. "Will Isaiah and the others attend the church service?" Elsa asked, curious about how racial segregation applied to religious worship. Mrs. Cooper's expression tightened slightly. "They have their own church. Has a midnight service too." Her tone suggested she recognized the contradiction, but had accepted it as the way things were. The Christmas Eve dinner itself proved to be a revelation. The Cooper home was filled with people, family members from nearby towns, neighboring ranches, and all the ranch workers regardless of race or status. While certain social divisions remained visible in seating arrangements and conversational groupings, the overall atmosphere was one of shared celebration. The food was abundant beyond anything the German women had seen since before the war: a roast turkey and a ham, cornbread stuffing, sweet potatoes with brown sugar and pecans, green beans cooked with bacon, biscuits and gravy, 3 kinds of pie for dessert. Even with rationing still in effect for many items, the meal represented a display of plenty that underscored America's productive capacity. After dinner, as people gathered in groups around the main room, Samuel brought out his harmonica. He began with Silent Night, a melody immediately familiar to the German women as Stille Nacht. Without planning or announcement, Ingrid began to sing the German lyrics softly. The room gradually fell silent as her clear voice carried the traditional carol. When she finished, there was a moment of poignant silence. Then Rufus's wife, who had joined them for the holiday, began Go Tell It on the Mountain, a spiritual with roots in the slavery era, but transformed into a Christmas celebration of freedom. Her powerful voice filled the room with a different tradition, equally moving in its expression of faith and hope. One by one, others contributed: American carols, German songs, even a Spanish villancico from one of the Mexican-American ranch hands. It was not the forced unity of ideological conformity, but the genuine harmony of diverse traditions finding common ground in shared humanity. Later, as some guests departed for church services and others continued socializing, Elsa found herself standing on the porch with Mr. Cooper. The Texas night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the vast darkness above the ranch. "Your first Christmas as a prisoner," Cooper observed. "Not what you expected, I imagine." Elsa smiled. "Nothing about America has been what I expected, Mr. Cooper." "Call me James," he said, surprising her with the informality. "After 6 months working my ranch, I think we're past Mr. Cooper." "James," she acknowledged with a nod. "And no, this is not the America I was taught about. The country I was told was chaotic, degenerate, materialistic, without culture or principles." Cooper, James, chuckled. "Well, some of that's not entirely wrong. We've got our share of chaos and materialism, but we've also got something else, something harder to see but more important." "What is that?" Elsa asked, genuinely curious about how this practical, unsentimental man would articulate what he valued in his country. He considered for a moment, watching the distant headlights of cars heading toward the town church. "Room to become something different than what you started as," he said finally. "Isaiah's grandfather was property. His grandson might be anything. My father was a poor dirt farmer. I own one of the biggest ranches in the county. That German girl in there, Ingrid, 6 months ago she'd never been on a horse. Now she rides like she was born to it." He turned to look at Elsa directly. "That's America's real power, not just making things, though we do that better than anybody, but making possibilities, letting people become something new." It was a perspective on power fundamentally different from the Nazi emphasis on racial identity, blood heritage, and fixed hierarchy. Cooper was describing a system that valued transformation, adaptation, and individual development, rather than rigid adherence to predetermined categories. "Do you think Germany could have such possibilities?" Elsa asked. "After the war, after defeat?" Cooper didn't dismiss the question. "Depends on what you build from the ruins, I expect. Whether you hold on to old ideas about who belongs where, or whether you make room for people to surprise you, like you ladies surprised me." The winter months brought new challenges to the ranch. Cold fronts swept down from the north, sometimes dropping temperatures below freezing. The German women, now fully integrated into the ranch operation, took on increased responsibilities as several more of the remaining cowboys were drafted into military service. Ingrid, whose natural affinity for horses had developed into genuine expertise, was placed in charge of the ranch's breeding program, keeping meticulous records and making recommendations that even Isaiah respected. Helga, with her technical mindset, became responsible for maintaining and repairing the increasingly complex equipment that modern ranching required. Frida worked closely with Mrs. Cooper on the domestic management of the ranch, while Gerda assisted Mr. Cooper with the business aspects, her mathematical skills proving valuable for accounting and inventory. Elsa found herself in a coordination role, bridging communication between the various operational areas and helping to plan the overall work schedule. It was, she realized with some irony, essentially a staff officer position similar to what she might have eventually attained in the Luftwaffe had the war progressed differently. The news from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany. Allied forces had crossed into German territory. Berlin was under constant bombardment. The once mighty Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. Yet for the German women at Cooper Ranch, these developments seemed increasingly distant, as if happening to a different country than the one they had left. "Do you miss Germany?" Elsa asked Ingrid one evening as they checked on a mare about to foal. Ingrid considered the question thoughtfully, her face illuminated by the lantern they had brought to the stable. "I miss the Germany I thought existed," she said finally. "The one I believed in before the war. The one with universities and music and philosophy. But I'm not sure that Germany was ever real. Maybe it was always becoming what it is now and I just didn't see it. And what about this?" Elsa gestured at the stable, the ranch, the Texas landscape beyond. "Is this real? This America we're experiencing?" "Parts of it," Ingrid said. "The work is real. The relationships are real. The contradictions are real too. The way Isaiah and the others are respected here, but face discrimination elsewhere. The possibilities and the limitations exist together." It was an astute analysis, reflecting the intellectual capacity that had once aimed her toward an academic career before the war redirected her path. Ingrid had not abandoned her analytical mind, merely applied it to different questions than she had anticipated. In February 1945, news reached them of the Yalta Conference, where Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin had met to plan the post-war organization of Europe. The details were sparse, but the implication was clear. Germany's defeat was considered so certain that the victorious powers were already determining how to divide the conquered nation. "They're talking about occupation zones," Gerda reported, after hearing a radio news broadcast. "American, British, French and Soviet sections. Germany won't exist as an independent country anymore." The information was sobering but not surprising to the women who had long since accepted the inevitability of German defeat. Their concern now was more practical. What would happen to them, to their families, to the German people trying to survive amid the collapse of the Nazi regime? "The important thing will be the local authorities," Isaiah observed when they discussed the news. "Papers from Washington or London or Moscow can say whatever they want, but it's the officers on the ground, the people running each town and village, who'll determine how folks are actually treated." It was another lesson in American pragmatism, the recognition that abstract policies were less significant than their practical implementation. That individual actions often mattered more than grand pronouncements. As spring returned to Texas, bringing wildflowers and renewed growth to the ranch, the women's thoughts increasingly turned to the future. Their status as prisoners of war would eventually end. They would return to a Germany fundamentally transformed, bearing the knowledge and experience gained on an American ranch under the guidance of black cowboys. On May 7, 1945, the news they had long anticipated finally arrived. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The German women gathered in the main house as Mr. Cooper turned up the radio to hear President Truman's announcement. "This is what we've been preparing for," Elsa said to her companions afterward. "Not just the end of the war, but the beginning of rebuilding." In the days that followed, they received official notification that repatriation would begin within months. Their time at Cooper Ranch was coming to an end. On their final evening at the ranch, a special dinner was arranged. Everyone who had worked alongside them gathered: Isaiah, Samuel, Rufus, the Cooper family, even Major Dawson from Camp Swift. "You came here as enemies," Mr. Cooper said, standing to address the group. "You leave as friends. More than that, as people who understand something essential about America that many Americans don't even see." Isaiah stepped forward, his imposing presence commanding attention as it had that first day. "Power isn't about domination," he said simply. "Real power is about creation, about building something that lasts, something that grows." Elsa looked at her fellow Germans, seeing in their eyes the same recognition that had transformed her own understanding. They had arrived believing in the superiority of German discipline, racial homogeneity, and centralized control. They were leaving with a profound appreciation for the strength found in diversity, adaptability, and individual initiative. As dawn broke on their departure day, Elsa stood one last time on the ranch porch, watching the Texas sunrise illuminate the land that had become unexpectedly significant in her life's journey. Isaiah joined her, his weathered face solemn. "When you get home," he said, "remember what you learned here. Not just about cattle and horses, but about people, about what makes a nation truly strong." "I will," Elsa promised. We all will. Germany's future depends on it. The convoy of army trucks arrived shortly after breakfast. The women gathered their few possessions, said their goodbyes and boarded the vehicles that would take them first to a processing center, then eventually back to Germany. As the trucks pulled away, Elsa looked back at Cooper Ranch, at Isaiah, Samuel and Rufus standing beside Mr. Cooper, at the landscape that had challenged and changed them, at the place where they had discovered America's true power. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.